In the world of film study and analysis, one of the most enduring and fascinating topics is the film trope. The film trope is defined as a storytelling device that may take the form of a character, an object, or a situation that conveys a meaning to the audience, and could, at times, progress the story while doing so. For horror film directors, however, the inclusion and creation of tropes are vital to enact powerful and memorable storytelling that audiences worldwide can then grow to appreciate and grow frightened by. One popular trope in horror films is the haunted house, usually in the form of an antiquated Victorian home. A structure so unnerving yet almost believable to the point that much of a film's horror stems from it, with the haunted house becoming a breeding ground for the said horrors. Another trope would be the horror villain, taking the form of a slasher such as Jason Voorhees, or perhaps a human so distorted in their morality and goals to the point that they are monsters themselves. In essence, horror movie directors and tropes mesh together as automobiles operate on gasoline, a perfect marriage in which two forces collide into robust synchronicity. One of the most revolutionary directors, as well as one that was so ahead of his time in his reliance on tropes and theatrical tricks in which he directly interacted with the audience, is William Castle.
I'm William Castle, and I feel obligated to warn you about the next attraction you will see at this theater.
Orphaned at age 11 and dropping out of high school at age 15 to work at a theater where he would specialize in promoting and marketing, Castle was one of the most eccentric filmmakers in cinematic history and ultimately one of the most influential. Like many directors during Hollywood's golden age, Castle began his film career through studio-approved yet low-budget westerns, dramas, and film noirs where he would grit his teeth and hone his natural skills of competent and yet entertaining storytelling. Soon, Castle would grow tired of the films that he was typically assigned to direct and relegated focus towards an exciting and different genre, and one that garnered massive profits: horror. From 1958 to 1974, William Castle's filmography almost exclusively consisted of horror films. From macabre 1958 to 1964's Strait-Jacket, with famed classic Hollywood actress Joan Crawford in the lead role as a homicidal maniac, a common role she would find herself in throughout the 60s, William Castle became a household name for horror movie fans, teenage couples seeking thrilling experiences at drive-in movie theaters, and film critics alike. Castle's style of horror, which he would become synonymous with after his passing, was a style of constant trope usage. Rather than relying heavily on dialogue, Castle would resort to jump scares and horror gimmickry, allowing for a combination of atmospheric sets already well established in the horror genre, or cliches that would become more prevalent in the horror genre into the modern era we're in today. For example, in House on Haunted Hill 1959, an absolutely classic murder mystery starring Vincent Price, and an archetypal haunted house film is riddled with jump scares. Notably, until the 1970s, jump scares had been seldom utilized in the horror genre. As opposed to employing jump scares, directors would usually resort to creating a haunting atmosphere and a creepingly slow pace to reflect the horrors of a film. While jump scares could also be viewed as a cliché, for Castle, the jump scare represented something greater in his films, in which they changed the trajectory of the film. While the characters may be coming to an agreement on a specific matter, a jump scare can occur in the presence of one character or every character, thus shifting the story in a different direction. For Castle, the wants and desires of the audience were his key focuses, due to his background in marketing that he had gained from working in a theater throughout his adolescence.
Let me ask you a question. Were you holding his hands throughout the picture?
I was holding him back. He was running out.
Therefore, Castle would implement the jump scare to thrill moviegoers, as the characters in the film would be thrilled. Moreover, another trope that Castle had exhibited on a consistent basis is the bait and switch, in which an evil antagonist almost receives justice or is almost defeated, until it is discovered that the quote-unquote hero is the true antagonist of the film and was so all along, as seen in House on Haunted Hill, showcasing Castle's curious take on the infamous twist ending in cinema. For William Castle's filmmaking, towards the end of the 1950s, when he descended into the world of horror, his history of marketing became an integral part of his filmmaking, style, and overall films, as Castle single-handedly created his own tropes. Like Hitchcock, Castle would usually appear in the trailers of his own films, yet largely unlike Hitchcock would take full advantage of theater gimmicks. For instance, for his 1959 monster movie The Tingler, about a grotesque monster that grows inside of the spinal cords of human beings, and can only be stunted or defeated when the infected person screams, Castle would plant buzzers in theater seats that would go off whenever the monster would be revealed. both terrifying and exciting the moviegoers that came to see his films. This method was dubbed Percepto, and drew commanding crowds at movie theaters. The Tingler also starred the master of menace yet enjoyable Vincent Price in the lead role, and is noted for having this especially grotesque color sequence in which a woman infected with the Tingler parasite is given LSD, which then prompts her to see horrific visions. Possibly the first time in film history in which we actually see what looks to be drug-induced hallucinations on screen. And the hand emerging from the bath of blood does make for an effective shot. The following year, at least in terms of audience interaction, Alfred Hitchcock would employ a similar yet less direct tactic when promoting his iconic film Psycho, in which he disallowed movie theaters from allowing people into the movie after it started, so that would-be audience members wouldn't get confused as to where Janet Leigh's character was. The character promoted the most across all of the film's marketing in the form of movie posters and trailers. Hitchcock felt that, because Janet Leigh's character of Marion Crane is killed off so early in the film and everyone had an idea that she was the protagonist, those late moviegoers would have been confused and possibly enraged, let alone the idea that Psycho was a powerful reaction to William Castle and his jabs at Hitchcock in a way. A notion that film historians tend to agree with. In another example where Castle made the film more inclusive for audiences, for House on Haunted Hill, Castle would devise the gimmick of emergo, in which a floating skeleton on a near-invisible string would be flown over the audience whenever a walking skeleton would appear in the film. Inevitably, when children across the country became aware of the gag, they would equip themselves with slingshots and shoot rocks and other small objects at the skeletons, jeopardizing the gimmick entirely. Amusingly, and more recently, some theaters across the country have employed the same gimmick of emergo over the audiences that arrived to the movie's screening. In yet another example, Mr. Sardonicus from 1961, Castle had fully left the outcome of the film and its ending to be decided by the audience. If most of the theater attendees voted for Mr. Sardonicus, who is a wretched sadist and torturer of women, to become struck by a permanent grin and can never eat again, thus starving to death, then the film would receive such an ending. On the other hand, if the audience voted to cure Mr. Sardonicus of the illness he had faced throughout the aforementioned film, he would be spared. Needless to say, practically every theater voted for him to suffer. For yet another film, 13 Ghosts from 1960, Castle introduced a gimmick called Illusiono, in which audience members were given 3D glasses with two main compartments, a red cellophane cover that they would put on whenever ghosts would appear on the screen, and a blue cellophane eye cover for the scenes that did not feature the ghosts, but featured the sets and actors themselves. The movie, while entertaining, relies very heavily on the gimmick, though the ghost special effects are still charmingly fun today. Though Castle would become known primarily for directing low-budget horror films that sometimes accentuated cheap thrills and scares, Castle's past of marketing and understanding the temperaments of an audience served him greatly throughout his career in filmmaking, even inspiring the likes of Alfred Hitchcock to take similar measures with films of his own. Due to Castle's gimmicks and tactics to sell tickets through his marketing expertise, Castle's gimmicks, emphatically speaking, became tropes of their own. By the mid-60s, audiences would associate theatrical gimmickry with William Castle, with the gimmicks becoming an intrinsic and central part of Castle's filmmaking strategies and abilities. By the late 60s, Castle would even serve as the producer for 1968's Rosemary's Baby, marking a seismic career shift that still reverberates today. Overall, Castle's influences and experience, stemming from his work in theater, became as ideal as the bond between filmmakers and time-tested or new tropes. A director of eccentricity and scares, his influence continues to reverberate in the minds of contemporary filmmakers and movie theaters looking to innovate. In 1993, Joe Dante, the director of such films as Gremlins from 1984 and The Burbs, directed Matinee in 1993, which serves as a quasi-biopic on William Castle. In an incredibly wonderful film, John Goodman portrays the character of Lawrence Woolsey, who is a fictionalized version of Castle. It is a recommended watch. All in all, William Castle was way ahead of his time in his efforts to both manipulate with and understand the audience, cementing his place in the universes of horror, cinema, and filmmaking alike.